Hey everybody, welcome back. Steve from the Pinball Room, and today we're just going to sit here at our laptop and work on our config file so we can get Mission Pinball Framework to be aware of all the great mechs we just finished installing on our pinball machine, right? If you remember from my earlier videos, and actually in the description of every video, I have a link to a Google Doc that I've created, which is a tutorial to how to get your lower third working. That's kind of a lie. It's not even your lower third. It's just a very, very simple anemic config file that allows you to get power safely to your flippers and your slingshots and nothing else. But that was enough for the playtesting we were doing initially, right? With our cardboard and shooting the ball around, it was great. But now we've moved beyond that. We have all these great mechs. We've got a scoop, we've got a pop bumper, we've got a load of drop targets, we've got a spinner. I want to playtest with those. When the ball goes inside that scoop, I don't want it to just sit there. I want it to pop back out so I can keep hitting other shots. Well, until we tell the software that there's even a scoop there, there's no way for it to know when it should kick the ball back out, right? So that's what we got to focus on today. So Mission Pinball Framework has a tutorial that goes through in exhaustive detail and does a great job of explaining all the different types of things you can define and how to define them inside the config file. I'm not going to try to cover that in a single video. It would take hours, if not days. There's a lot. I mean, you can imagine a complete pinball machine, all the different possible things you can do. There's a lot. Cannot give them enough credit for how hard they've been working on this thing. It's still actively supported here in 2022. No signs of slowing down. I highly recommend you use it. Okay, now we just need to understand kind of the basics of how a config file works. And I feel if I can do this succinctly, it'll help you just kind of grasp, oh, this is kind of the general way things are assembled and organized inside the config file. It'll make it a lot easier for you to start thinking about, well, what if I added this type of mech to it? And it's not exactly in Steve's examples or MPF's examples a little bit, right? You'll be able to piece it together, and all the tutorial information will make a lot more sense. So let me turn on my screen recording software here, share my screen with you, and let's start talking through kind of the basics of a config file. So first thing first, all this stuff I'm highlighting here at the very top left, this is just kind of basic stuff. It has to be in there. I don't know really a great way to explain it. MPF on their site goes through and explains exactly what each one is for. It's kind of self-explanatory, but I think it suffices to say right now, if you're using the fast pinball controller board set that I am, you can pretty much just copy and paste everything I have up here and you're gonna be working fine. The exception, if you remember from my tutorial, is the ports. You need to make sure that you have these identified correctly to the ports that your machine, your computer, is actually assigning to these, to the Nano controller board, right? Mine is COM port 4 and 5. You'll notice I'm inside Notepad++. I highly recommend you get yourself a little bit more robust text editor than just like Notepad or WordPad or whatever little basic thing came on your operating system. You want to have, you can use it, but you want to have, I think it would be helpful if you have a text editor that is just a little bit more robust in its features. Notepad++, probably the most important thing, is it allows you to define what your tab spacing actually is. Meaning when you hit the tab key, is it really just like a tab input? Or, no, what we want are actual space inputs, like hitting the space bar 4 times, that's a tab, right? Same distance. But in lots of programs, if you just hit the tab button, it doesn't really tell the computer the same thing as 4 spaces. And in this config file, it's not a text file, it's a YAML file, .yaml. And this file, to be interpreted correctly by Mission Pinball Framework and not have it barf out a whole bunch of log files and not work for you, every time you're indenting, as you can see in here, we're indenting quite a bit. It needs to be precisely 4 spaces of the keyboard. Now, Notepad++, I can define in my preferences every time I hit the tab key on my keyboard, it'll just put in 4 spaces and I'm fine. Some of your just kind of free basic ones won't do that and it's going to cause you grief. So you've been warned. All right, get a decent text editor. Okay, we'll move on from that. Okay. A config file in its final state is going to be very overwhelming. It is for me still. There's like so much stuff in it. I don't understand what half of it is trying to explain or really do. And it's just like a pinball machine, right? The first time, like in our pinball overview video, we popped the hood of a pinball machine. We saw 3,000 feet of wire underneath the Simpsons pinball machine. And we thought, how in the world are we ever going to make sense of this and be able to create one of our own? And what did we do? We said, let's look at this a piece at a time. A pinball machine is really just a matter of a repetition of 3 or 4 simple mechanical things that are just repeated all across the playfield, right? You've got coils that are hooked up to flippers and to drop bank targets and things like that. But at the end of the day, it's just a coil that gets power and is told when to suck that rod in or push it out, right? So, okay, that's not so hard. And all the wire, okay, you've got your input, your ground. If we break it down into simple systems, it becomes more approachable, right? Where the config file, I feel the config file can be looked at the same way. A config file is going to go through. You'll notice I have sections in here. And again, my nice Notepad system lets me go through and collapse these sections. Okay, I've got sections for flippers, auto fire coils, switches, etc. Right? So what we're basically doing is we're taking all the simple systems and we're just defining them down in their smallest parts. And we're giving them names so we can recognize which coil and which switch is which and which ones go together. And then we're going to combine them into ball devices and groups of things. So, for example, let's look at our flippers section. We have a section called flippers. Now for MPF, it has to be called exactly flippers, spelled this way. That's like a core term that, and the software turns on, it runs to your config file, and it looks for a section called flippers, so it knows how to work your flippers. If you name it something different, doohickeys, it's not going to find it, they're not going to work. Okay, so flippers needs to be called flippers, coils need to be called coils, switches needs to be called switches, auto fire coils is the name it wants for auto fire coils like slingshots and pop bumpers. And there's a handful of those, and again, the MPF tutorial will walk you through all of them. They have a great section. Let's look at our config file, again, similar to those simple systems underneath our play field. So let's start with the flippers. So here, my first entry here, I've indented in, and I've defined my left flipper. Now this, I can name whatever I want. This is just a label. I call it left flipper. It could be called L flipper, L_flipper, Bobby's flipper, whatever you want. Okay, that doesn't really matter, and you can have as many as you want because every game can. Right now I've got 3. I'm going to end up having 5 if things work out. Like you can have a bunch of flippers, so that doesn't really matter. But then we've got nested inside that kind of the ingredients or each individual component that is needed in order for that what we call a left flipper to actually really work, right? So these should be pretty obvious, right? We have our main coil. I'm using dual wound coils, so I've got my high power coil and I've got a lower one that's my hold power. So if I hold the button in, it doesn't burn out my flipper coil, right? So main coil, and that needs to be called main coil. MPF is looking for that. It's called a main coil. Then you have a hold coil, and then I've got an activation switch, which switch is going to activate that coil. Okay, then after each of these, I have, again, label C flipper left main. I could have called that C stands for coil. That's kind of the nomenclature I'm using, right? The naming convention I'm using. It could have been just left flipper main, all written together one word. Didn't really matter, but you have to be very consistent, and it helps if you follow a pattern for all the things you're defining. So I'm sticking with what MPF suggests. I recommend you do the same until you get super comfortable with it. But my left flipper has a coil, main coil. What coil is that? C left flipper main. Has a switch. What switch is that? S for switch left flipper. Okay, great. Well, guess what? Those ingredients correspond to other sections in this config file, right? Think of the flippers section, the auto fire coil section, the drop target section as being kind of groupings of other things, right? Again, groupings of coils and switches primarily. So then I go down to my next section. Now I have one of these kind of lower level groups, coils. Just all my basic coils in my game. I've got several in here. I've got the coils for my flipper, left flipper main, left flipper hold, right flipper main, right flipper hold, flipper right upper main, flipper right upper hold, and then I've got slingshot left, slingshot right, and I added this new entry for a pop bumper. C pop bumper lower is what I called it. Okay, and then down below, forget auto fire coils right now, we'll come back to that. Switches. Now I have my switches group of definitions inside my config file. I list out all my switches. Right now I've got left flipper, I've got right flipper, I've got right upper flipper because I've got a 2-stage leaf flipper in here, right? Left slingshot, right slingshot. Now there's 2 switches per slingshot if you remember right, but I have those connected so they really act as if it's one switch. You don't need to have that actually be independent switches defined here, right? The 2 physical switches are all on the same wire, so it's considered one switch here, okay? And then I've got a switch for my pop bumper, S pop bumper lower, okay? And I've gone through and started to play around with what I think is the right language for my drop bank switches, drop bank target, my drop target 4-bank switches, and my optical switch for my VUC, for my scoop. And what's inside each one of these? I've got a number, and this number corresponds to the switch input on my actual fast I/O board. So this is the very first switch running back to my 3208. So the 3208 is my very first board, so it's 0, and then a hyphen, so first board, and then very first switch input, so 0, 0. The next, my right flipper, it's 0, 1, first board, second switch. So again, let's go look up here at our flippers. For me to define my left flipper, I have to define my main coil, my hold coil, and my switch. Well, what are those? Those are the coils and the switches that I outlined down below in the coils and switches sections. Okay, so let's think about this now, right? Hopefully you can figure this out now, right? If I want to add a pop bumper, well, what type of device is a pop bumper? Go to MPF. They list out all the different types of like devices you can define inside your config file. Flippers, drop banks, drop targets, spinners, I believe, and then they have like targets, stand-up targets, etc. And then they've got one called auto-fire coils. Auto-fire coils, like we said, are like slingshots and pop bumpers, the best examples. There's never any logic. If the switch gets hit, it gets fired no matter what, right? Pop bumper gets hit, it's going to fire. So we're going to create a section called auto-fire coils. And what are we going to put inside there? Well, we're going to indent one, and we're going to name that auto-fire coil. I'm going to name mine something pop bumper lower. AC lower pop bumper. Okay? And then what are the ingredients for my pop bumper? I've got a coil and I've got a switch. So guess what we put in here? Coil. This was not main and hold because they just have a single one. So coil, and then C pop bumper lower. Guess what? That's the pop bumper coil that we defined up above, right? And then switch, S pop bumper lower. Well, that was one of the switches we defined inside here. Okay? So again, take your device, break it down to the components. A coil, a switch, maybe it's an optical switch, like the type of switch, right? Define them in their group, in their little section, and then take those ingredients, figure out the name in MPF of what that device is. Oh, that's a flipper. That's a drop target. It's an auto-fire coil. Go to that section inside your config file. If it's not there yet, add it. Put in the line auto-fire coils, and then indent and put in the name of that one that you want to call it. So like left slingshot, lower pop bumper, and then indent again and put in the ingredients. Coil, the name of the coil you defined. Switch, name of the switch you defined. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. That's really kind of the basic approach for almost everything you're going to be adding in to MPF's config file. Now, no, it's not exactly that simple. You'll notice in here there's a few different things, right? Like some of these coils have like default pulse MS. That's for how long should the electrical current be pulsed in a quick pulse in milliseconds MS to that coil, right? And you can define that. That way you can control the strength of your flippers. Some switches are normally closed, some are normally open, and so you'll define that in here. So there are a few extra little lines here and there, but don't worry about those right now, okay? Go through one type of device at a time and go to MPF's tutorial, look through in their menu for that specific entry. In fact, let me show you really fast. I got my screen recording here. All right, let's go over here. docs.missionpinball.org. Bookmark this site. It's going to help you so much. Mission Pinball Framework, version 0.55. All right, user documentation. Scroll down here. Inside MPF user manual, pinball mechanisms, okay? Open that one up. Look, you got accelerometers, auto-fire coils, ball devices, coils, diverters, flippers, you name it, it's all in here. So say, hey Steve, I want to go through and add in my pop bumper, but I forgot what you told me how to do it, exactly the code. I don't want to watch your stupid video all over again. Great, click on this, click the pop bumpers, boom. Related sections, auto-fire coil, switches, lights, coils, has pictures of the hardware. Hey, here's kind of how they work, etc., right? It defines it's made of 3 elements, a blade switch, a bulb, a coil to push it away, common part numbers. Okay, and guess what? Here's a sample config file that would just handle this specific type of device. And what's it have? Switches. The name of it, pop bumper left. Okay, the number of the switch, or the ground terminal for the board, right? Coils. Hey, there's a coil section. Pop bumper left. Again, it's input, right? Lights. We haven't done lights for any of ours yet, but you can add it, have a light section. Inside your light section, you're going to find all your lights. My pop bumper left light. Great. What number is it? And then auto-fire coils. This is the group for it. It's an auto-fire coil. Pop bumper left, coil, etc. Each one of these sections will go through and show you and tell you exactly what needs to go in there, right? Okay, so that really pretty much does it, guys. That's it for the day. Let's wrap up again here, right? So what did we learn? I highly recommend you look at your config file in the similar fashion we do to the physical play field, all right, that we're designing. Meaning break it down to individual mechanisms and little interactions one at a time, all right? A slingshot, the other slingshot, okay? A flipper, a plunger, a pop bumper, a drop target. Look at it one piece at a time in your config file, right? Go through and do just the first section to define your hardware. Great. Identify your COM ports. Great. One thing at a time, okay? Then your flippers. Do your flippers, I think we're already at that point, right? And then comes time for the next one. I want to do a pop bumper. Great. Just look up on MPF. Give yourself a refresher of exactly how things need to be labeled. This one says coil, not main coil. Okay, great. Throw it in. Do them one at a time. Save it. Load up on your computer. Hook it up. Power it on. See if that one device works. Great. It does. We feel confident. Let's move on to the next one. Let's do our second pop bumper. You're feeling confident. Maybe you do all 3 pop bumpers in your little set all at once and then test those, because it's pretty much the same thing, right? Make sure you get your numbers right and your switch inputs correct, and you'll be good. That's it for today. I hope it was super helpful. I hope it made sense. Let me know in the comments what you think about it. If there's anything you felt that maybe I went too fast or got wrong, tripping over my words, let me know. Get out there, build your own freaking pinball machine. You guys can do it, all right? We can do this. Take care, everybody. See you next time.